Good afternoon. It's Jeffrey Christian. It's just past noon on Tuesday, July 2nd here in New York. I want to talk today about gold is politics and politics are gold. This can be a unnecessarily contentious topic because some people can't deal with politics in a rational fashion and they just get their backs up. They shouldn't, but they do. Last week I was talking about the state of the markets, and I wandered into the political world. And Herman wrote to me, "Stick to metals, please not politics." Herman, that's a very naive view. I'm sorry. It is a very naive view. I want to start with two anecdotes. In the 1970s, I was working on new newsletters, did one on electric vehicles, but we created other ones too. And one had to do with fertilizers. And I was actually also working on covering the copper and precious metals markets and doing other work in the oil and gas markets where I was working at the time. One day, one of the people who was writing for the fertilizer newsletter asked me to have lunch. And he said, this is great. I'm glad to have this job and all, but I would love to have the opportunity to write about politics and what's going on in Washington. This is 1979, 1980. The election, hostages in Iran, Soviet troops in Afghanistan, high inflation, Paul Volcker taking over the Fed. I'd love to have the chance to write about all that stuff. And I said, we all would. And he looked at me and said, "Jeff, I'm asking if there's space for me to write about precious metals too, because all of those things are important in precious metals." And in fact, there have been people who have criticized us saying, we really don't know about gold and silver. We do. We know more about gold and silver than anybody else on earth. But what CPM Group doesn't know about gold and silver, they complain. They just are really good at talking about the state of the world, the state of the global economy, the state of the world stock market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The gold market is inextricably bound up with politics. Domestic politics, global politics. You can't be naive. Now, some of you might know, when I was in university in the 70s, I studied journalism and I studied political science. And my focus on political science had a lot to do with how communist countries traded. So it was really political international economics. It was international political science and international economics. And I did a lot of work, this was at a time of détente with the Soviet Union, rapprochement with China. So I met various people who were beginning to be allowed to have university exchange programs with professors in Russia and with China. They would come over and spend time at our university. I studied that stuff. That's why I have this poster behind me. This poster is from 1976, was when the Soviet Union allowed foreign journalists and foreigners to be in Moscow during one of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union conventions, which I think occurred every 5 years, if I remember correctly. I studied this stuff. In my business, I have worked since the 70s with Russian and Chinese counterparts and clients, as I have with people from virtually every other country in the world. So I kept apace with that. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of discussion about what this mean for the gold market, the platinum market, the copper market, titanium, timber, oil and gas, obviously. All these things that were major industries and export products of the Soviet Union. And I was giving a presentation on gold or platinum or silver at the time, and someone was asking me about my expectations of the future of what was had been the Soviet Union. What's going to happen there domestically, politically, socially, economically, and what's it mean for the world? And I said, I tend to focus on talking about the economy and financial markets and the precious metals markets. I'm kind of uncomfortable talking about and projecting, and particularly projecting, politics and political developments. And somebody who knew my background was in the audience and said, Jeff, isn't that in fact your area of expertise? That's what you studied in college. So I answered the question. The point is, don't be naive. Politics and gold are hand in glove, and you have to understand politics if you want to understand the gold market. And if you want to trade well or invest well in gold, you have to understand politics. Even if it hurts, even if it challenges those things that you don't even know why you feel and believe, you have to understand those politics. You have to go through it. Additionally, as some of you probably know, we have been saying for a year now that politics will probably be even more important in 2024 and 2025 than economics, perhaps, in determining investor trends in gold and silver buying and selling. So, always important, even more important now. I hate to tell you, but it is. So politics matter. Yeah, the rise of the right on a global basis, the rise of authoritarians like Putin and Kim Jong-un, Viktor Orban in Hungary, folks in the United States. All of that matters. And if you want to get your gold projections right, supply, demand, fabrication demand, investment demand, and price, you've got to pay attention to politics, and you've got to do it in a dispassionate, objective way. Politics matter in the United States. Biden's debate performance, Lyndon Johnson saying, given the fact that we were totally bamboozled and we're totally unprepared about the Tet Offensive, I'm not going to run for president. I'm going to try to fix the Vietnamese War. The Army had lied to the Pentagon. The Army had lied to the president and his men. They had been deceived what was going on. Actually, just last week, a wonderful lady who was in military intelligence in 1967-68 in Vietnam and had issued a report saying, hey, there's a concentration of 50,000 enemy troops in South Vietnam that are planning for something big in terms of an attack, probably meant to coincide with the Tet Offensive. And she was black and female and lesbian. And the military ignored her warnings. The Tet Offensive occurred, and it revealed to the administration the extent to which the Pentagon had been deceiving them about how the war in Vietnam was going. And Lyndon Johnson stood down. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, a good and honorable person when politicians were good and honorable, stood for president and lost to Richard Nixon. All of that happened in a context very important to gold. Lyndon Johnson, the same month that he said he wasn't going to run for president, closed the private sector gold window and said, if you are a private entity and you have U.S. dollars, you can no longer come to the U.S. Treasury and say, here are my dollars, give me your gold at $35 an ounce. He closed the public sector, which was central banks doing that. Nixon closed in 71. But Lyndon Johnson closed the private sector window the same month he said, we were lied to, the Tet Offensive was disaster, Vietnam is a disaster, we now know that, and I'm not going to run for president. Inexorably tied to the gold market. There had been an enormous amount of gold bought from the Treasury at $35 an ounce in 1967. There was an even larger volume in terms of the pacing that occurred in the first 3 months of 1968. I stand corrected. He stood down from, said he wouldn't run for re-election on March 31st, 1968. He closed the gold window in April of 68, about 2 weeks later. So it wasn't actually the same month. It was about 2 weeks apart. You gotta assume, you gotta admit that politics matter, and getting it straight from an analytical perspective matters. If you don't recognize the future vice presidential candidate in the picture on the left, that is David Duke. On the right is Charlottesville. Politics matter on both sides of the political spectrum. This is an American Nazi Party Congress at Madison Square Garden in 1939. Their slogan was "Make America Great Again." Politics matter to gold. Being impartial matters to gold. Don't think you know what others don't know. Don't think others don't know what you think you know, but maybe you actually don't know. Don't base your worldviews on movies. They are fiction. Don't tell me that Matrix or Die Hard with a Vengeance tell you something important about society other than we got a lot of glue heads who like stupid movies. Okay? Base your worldview on history and current affairs and unbiased analyses. Now, does CPM Group have a bias? Yes. We are biased toward truth and honesty. We're biased toward accuracy. We don't like it when people distort information about the gold market or the silver market, when they include producer forward selling as a form of spot physical metal, or producers unwinding their hedges as a form of spot physical demand. That's wrong. It's wrong. We don't like it when people say that investors are buying hundreds of millions of ounces when in fact they're buying 90 million ounces less than they had bought 2 years earlier. We like accuracy. We don't like politics and we don't like politicians. We have a bias toward sober fiscal policies and moving away from those kind of self-serving politicians and the machines that fund them and that control them. If you think you know our bias, you're probably wrong. If you probably are self-deluded, you probably have those kinds of mindsets that shut down. You're probably overly simplistic. Or maybe you do have it correct, and in which case you're probably very moralistic, brutally honest, and focused on what can be done that would be best for the world, for the United States, for your own commonwealth, and for oneself. This is CPM Group's track record calling the markets on an intermediate basis for the gold market since 1980. Politics have factored into this. You want us to not get into politics? You want us to be wrong on gold. Don't be naive. This is what I will read on the 4th of July. I read it every year on the 4th of July. You should read it too. It's pretty good, pretty fundamental. It has a bias. There's a bias toward truth and honesty and fairness. It has a bias toward individuals having the ability to maximize their own happiness without government interference. Another thing you might do on the 4th of July is review President Eisenhower's 1960 farewell address. You can get the transcript at the archives, National Archives, and you can watch a video on YouTube. Very important. I often say Eisenhower was the last real Republican president we had, because after that, the Republican Party went off the rails. We will be having our Platinum Group Medals Yearbook on Tuesday, the 16th of July, 2 weeks from today. You can go to our website and find out about it, sign up, and attend it. It's free. Our yearbook will be released on that day, and it's $160. You can pre-order it at our website. You can also have all kinds of other pre-reads. You could buy our gold yearbook, our silver yearbook, which came out in March and May. If you really want to know about what we think about silver, you should buy our silver yearbook. Don't buy my electric vehicle book from 1979, 1980. I mean, it's an interesting book. But if you say that you're interested in silver, buy the silver yearbook. It's tough. You got to read it. You got to understand it. But if you read it and understand it, you'll have a much better view of what's going on in the silver market. That's all I have for now. Take care of yourself. Take care of those around you. Maybe spend some time actually studying things on an unbiased basis. And we'll talk to you Friday.